Hello everyone. As Liam was saying, my name is Sangita and I am a Fulbright researcher here, and I just graduated last year. And so most people, when they have like a Fulbright project, they have some kind of personal connection to their project, or they have some background in the project itself. For me, it was a little bit different. I have a background in science and molecular biology, so it's kind of the smaller areas of science, but I've always had an interest in public health and kind of in the general scheme. But why Korea, right? So I grew up with a lot of Asian American friends, and I had a lot of Taiwanese friends, and so I started watching Taiwanese dramas, TV shows. And from there, I started watching Korean dramas and got really into the Korean culture, and I started knowing disparities in the shows between the men and the women, and I was curious about the sedentary lifestyle that I'd seen on the shows for the women and how that changed or how that related to their access to health. And as I explored further and got to a little more academically, then I fell upon the issue of immigrant access to healthcare. And so I decided to apply for the Fulbright, and here I am. So as the title suggests, an examination of healthcare access of migrant brides, I'm studying what the barriers are to access healthcare for the immigrant brides that are coming. Initially, I was just studying all the immigrant women, but now I specifically chose to focus on the brides. Within the past 20 years, there has been a large influx of immigrants coming into Korea to marry Korean men. And so there hasn't been much discussion about that yet. And so my project is here to kind of increase the dialogue that's been happening to speak for the rights of these women. So throughout my project, I have now condensed into three main barriers or factors that I found that involve the migrant woman status, the status of women and families, and the lower socioeconomic class and status of these women, as well as the men that they get married into. And so I'll talk about these further later in my presentation, but first I want to give a bit of a background of what my project is and why this issue is important right now. So, as you can see here, within the past 20 years especially, but a little bit earlier than that, there's been a large birth rate decline in Korea. So you can see over here in 1960, there was above a 6.0 for the births per woman, and so that's what the birth rate means. So for every woman who was fertile and who was able to generally, they calculate, conceive a child, 6 children were born per woman, and that was really high. And so at this point, they began family planning. And so Park Chung-hee was the dictator at the time, and he thought that there were too many births for each person, like for the economy and for the society to develop at the time. It was representing kind of what a developing country would look like rather than a growing first world economy system. And so they instituted family planning, and so they taught women about contraception. They tried to increase the education about that. They tried to push like having only one child. It wasn't a law, but it was something that they kind of encouraged. At the same time, there was lots of urbanization that was happening, later marriages along with urbanizations, and then with the higher education levels, there were more access to contraception, and people knew more about how to prevent getting babies. And with this, there was also an increase in women in the workforce. And so a lot of the women would leave the rural areas and come to the urban areas. Not as many of the men left because they were more tied to the land that was in the area. And so the women left, leaving it was a misproportion of ratios for man to women in the farmlands. And because of that, the men need to find someone to marry. And so, as you can see, a result of all of this was a rapid decline in birth rate. So right now, it's at 1.24, which means it's less than replacement level. Like replacement level would be 2. And so South Korea right now is the 5th lowest in the world as far as birth rate is concerned. And compared to the other 3 countries that are 3 main kind of like heads in Asia, South Korea is the lowest, but they're all roughly around the same. The reason why South Korea is the one that has more concern is the fact that it's declined so quickly. Japan has kind of a steady birth rate decline, so they have similar problems that Korea does, and since there's an aging population, there's not as many young people in the population to kind of replace the older generation. But with Japan, it's been a constant problem. It's nothing new for them. With Korea, right now, in the next 10 years, about a quarter of the population will be above the age of 65. And with now the urbanization and kind of modernization, the elderly don't live with the children as much anymore, so the government has to support the elderly, and they can't afford right now with Social Security to afford that for the future. Currently it's okay because the younger population is still large, but in 10 years it'll be really difficult for the government, which is why they have this Band-Aid approach of kind of trying to promote immigrant brides to come and marry South Korean men. And this is very different because so far Korea has been a fairly homogenous society, but recently within the past, like last year, 11% of the marriages were international marriages, and back in 2002 it was only about 4%. And so it's been increasing a lot, and because of that, it's something to consider about the difference in the racial heterogeneity. So here is a look at what the international marriage totals are. So this is looking at both men and women. For the men, it's relatively been constant throughout, but the women, it's steeply increased within the past few years. This is only looking at 2005, but if you look for a few years later until now, it's pretty much going like this. The countries the men come from tend to be US, Canada, some parts of Europe. The women tend to come from Southeast Asia, from lower socioeconomic statuses. And so this kind of mimics, if you guys are familiar with the North Korean refugees that are coming in. So in the older generations, North Korean refugees that came in were considered heroic because they survived and they escaped the country. But the current refugees that come out are escapees from like lower socioeconomic statuses. There's more prejudice and racial discrimination against them. And that's very similar to how the women and the men break down in South Korea. So here I am, and so my goal is to try to speak up for these women and try to increase the conversation that's happening. Because this has happened so recently within the past 20 years, most people in the government are just starting to change general citizenship laws, or just starting to look at maybe like labor migrants and starting to look at general policy, but they haven't looked at health yet. Health is kind of a second priority. And because these women are here now, and because the generations of children that they'll have in the future represents the next newer generation of what a mixed race society in Korea will look like in the future, it's really important to talk about the current health status of these women. So in my project, I look at both surveys that have been conducted of these women in the past, as well that measure like their health and happiness, and I also talk to the women themselves. The surveys that have been conducted are not thorough or comprehensive, and my goal of the study is not either to be thorough or comprehensive, but it's just to identify certain barriers that do exist. And so with doing interviews, you have to pass like IRB application and all of that, and so that has been a little bit of a tedious process itself, because this population is somewhat of a controversial population, because Korea is a little bit defensive about the fact that there are issues with their immigrant population coming in, and so I had to go through a long process to show them that I would protect their rights. I would only talk about certain things, and so only recently I got approval, and so I've only done a fraction of the interviews that I plan to do by now. But there's enough that I have novel information to talk about. So with meeting with these women, the way I meet with these women is through shelters. So there are two types of women that live in the urban areas and women that live in the rural areas. The ones that live in the rural areas, they tend to come in as massive groups from different countries. So it'll be like one city, there'll be a village leader who will be like, okay, everyone needs to get married, just sign up right here. We'll like bring in some women from Vietnam. While another city will be like, oh, we'll bring them in from the Philippines. Or the other one will be, we'll bring them in from Cambodia. So it tends to be pockets of countries that are in these villages. As opposed to in Seoul or in Busan or the more urban areas, they're kind of cherry picked. So it'll be like a Korean man will go individually to find like a marriage broker and see if he can get a wife, and then those tend to come from different countries. And the reason why this is important is because in the rural areas, even though it's a lower socioeconomic status, they tend to form communities. And so the women tend to, as far as the satisfaction proves, they tend to be a little happier because they're able to have more friends, and they aren't solely dependent on the husband, as opposed to in the urban areas, they are completely dependent on their husband and family for everything that they need, and that tends to show a difference in how their satisfaction with life is. So I go to the shelters, and obviously going to the shelters, it might seem like selection bias for who I'm talking to. I'm talking to women that have had problems. For some reason they're escaping their husband, for some reason they need help, they might have been abused, and so it might seem like I am obviously looking for the problems, and so that's what I'm targeting for, which is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to show what a happy marriage looks like. I'm not trying to prove like the differences between a happy and an unhappy marriage. What I want to see is identify the problems, and so going to the source allows me to identify those. And that's, again, I'm not trying to be completely comprehensive, but I am trying to identify certain barriers that haven't been talked about. So that I go to both the rural shelters as well as the urban shelters to talk to these women. It's important to understand what the ratio of the different races are in these women. So you can see this red over here is all of the women that are from China, and that tends to be a really large population and one that is decreasing as well, and that's mainly because there are a lot of Chinese Koreans, and they're considered like foreigner or immigrant populations as well. But their language skills are much better. They're fairly fluent in Korean, so they don't have as many issues with accessing healthcare as the others. And they've lived here for several generations, but they're still considered immigrants here. But there are also women that are from Vietnam. Vietnam is the one that's been increasing a lot over the past 5 years. So the Vietnamese women tend to be either late teens, around like 18 or 19, or early 20s, and they tend to marry men that are double the age of who they are. So it's usually like a 20-year-old marrying a 40-year-old, and sometimes they're the second marriage of the 40-year-olds. Sometimes the man already has kids, but for whatever reason, that usually tends to be the demographics of how it happens. And one of the issues with this is that when the Vietnamese women, they come in, they're really young, they have no idea what they're getting themselves into. When the marriage broker, the way that works is the marriage broker basically asks a woman in Vietnam, who wants to have a better life? You can leave the country and leave wherever you are, whichever like ground village you're at, and have a better life in Korea. And so these women just sign up, and then the marriage brokers just haul these men in from Korea. They get married, pick up their wife, and then take them back here to South Korea. And so these women don't know what they're getting themselves into. They don't know anything about their husband. And because they're in their peak, almost fertile stage of life, within the first couple of months they already have a baby, or they're already pregnant. And the issue with this is that after they get pregnant, then they look into a contraception. But because the husband doesn't want them to get contraception, or the mother-in-law doesn't want them to get contraception, they end up finding different avenues for how to prevent a baby, and then that ends up having its own issues as well, because unreliable medicine that they take, and things like that. For the Philippine women, these women tend to be older, so this is around mid-30s, marrying mid-40s of the Korean men. And one thing that's interesting about the Filipino women is that they tend to form communities stronger than the other races, at least by the statistics that show. So they tend to form like large church groups, as like this is a Filipino church. And so because of that, they have a community, and through that, they're able to understand how a little bit more how the health system works, or which doctors to go to, things like that, because they have more of a support group. And so it's interesting to look at the age differences to understand how the different populations work. In the others, this is a whole mixed bag of races, but one of the most recent influxes that have come in that's not been much literature published on, but I've only found out through talking to shelters, is women that are from Russia. So this is very different from the rest of Southeast Asia, coming in from Russia and Eurasia. These are women that tend to look almost half Korean. So they have really pale skin, kind of like wide, high cheekbones, and then really dark hair. And because of that, these women don't feel as much discrimination as the ones from Southeast Asia, because they don't look as different. And maybe because of this, or not because of this, a lot of these women, this is not like, I can't say this is scientific accuracy, but what has been a trend that a lot of the leaders in the shelters have talked about is that the women that run to the shelters that are from Uzbekistan or Russia, they tend to leave because they're more decisive and they're less submissive. And so the reason why they're leaving is not because like they have been abused, but because they're like, I'm not happy with this marriage, this is unsatisfactory, I just met this guy, I'm gonna leave. And so then they go to the shelters, and then it's a different type of dynamic because it varies from the general submissiveness that's generally sought after in these international marriage brides. So looking at this, I am going to go back to the initial 3 barriers that I talked about that I was able to somewhat condense my rough, what I've seen so far into. The first is migrant status. So looking at these women, so how it works, these women come in and they're usually already married by this point. So they marry in their own home country to the Korean man who brings them over. And so then they apply for an F6 visa. The F6 visa is a marriage visa. This allows them, as long as they're living with the husband, as long as the husband writes that this is their wife or family member, they're able to get healthcare access, and they're able to get all the resources that a normal citizen would get. You have to prove your marriage is healthy and you're still living with your husband for 2.5 years. Only after you live with your husband for 2.5 years can you apply for citizenship after that. And in this case, it's the husband that applies for the citizenship for the wife. And more often than not, the husband has no incentive to apply for citizenship for the wife unless, it's just they have a family and they just want everyone to be a citizen. But for the husband, it makes no difference whether the wife's a citizen or not because the same benefits are given for him. But to prove citizenship, you have to show you have an asset of $3,000. This is not $3,000 that you give to the government, but you show that you have an asset of $3,000 because that says that you have enough money to live in the country. So so after you prove that you have an asset of $3,000, then you can apply for citizenship. Applying for citizenship is somewhat similar, I guess, to other countries, which is where you have to, it's kind of a semi-long process to prove that you're a worthy citizen of the country, where at the end you take on the English test, you take different tests to show you're very knowledgeable about Korea. What is interesting that I found out is being born in Korea doesn't automatically make you a citizen of the country. So if you're born to a Korean father, that makes you a citizen, but if you're born just in Korea to non-Korean parents, you're not a citizen until somehow you apply for citizenship and then receive it later on in life. And then after this English test, then citizenship can be granted if you pass that. And so this is a full minimum of 4.5 years after entering the country. The reason why this is interesting is because what is advertised through the marriage brokers for a lot of these women that are coming in the country is that once you come to Korea, you're going to become an automatic citizen in this country, you're going to get all the rights, and that's what women think when coming in, but it takes a long process for them to get it, even if they follow all the steps. But a lot of the times the steps aren't followed, and so the women end up just having a F6 visa, which you still have to reapply for every 2 years. So if during that time, even if you're not divorced, if the husband and wife are living separately, then you cannot reapply for a visa because the husband has to prove that the wife is still living with him, and if they're not, the husband is not going to have any incentive to fill out the application, so no citizenship is granted. Then there's the problem of divorce. So divorce happens quite frequently amongst women who don't realize that that divorce can probably hurt their chances of living in the country as much as they do. So for example, there was this one woman who was a Nepalese woman that I had interviewed. So she came to this country and she married a Korean man, and she was really unhappy with the marriage, and so they divorced within a year. But the husband applied for the divorce, but he didn't apply properly. So technically her visa lasts 2 years. She couldn't leave the country until her visa ended because the divorce papers weren't filed properly. So she actually wanted to go back to her country but wasn't able to. And she was kind of stuck in kind of a limbo situation, but she wasn't a citizen either because the divorce papers were filed well enough that she wasn't a citizen. So she had to stay in a shelter for a year and get clinic services from the shelter itself until she could leave. Ironically enough, now she's in Nepal, but while she was in the shelter, she fell in love with one of the the brothers of the church that ran the shelter, and he's a Korean man, and she's marrying him, but he's moving to Nepal for her. So, yeah, that happens. And she's younger than me. She's 21, second marriage. But yeah, so that worked out. But because she didn't have a kid at that point, she didn't have any stake in society. So let's backtrack and explain. So 2 years, or specifically 2.5 years, is kind of it's like a magical cutoff, a little bit. So if you divorce before 2 years and you have no child, you end up kind of like this Nepalese woman. But if the divorce papers are filed properly, you can technically apply for citizenship, but it's a long, complicated process, and it tends not to happen because the Korean government has no incentive to give citizenship, and you have to prove your residency in that area, and you need to prove you have an asset of $3,000, which most of these women, when leaving a marriage, don't have. If you get a divorce after 2 years and no child, you're more likely to be granted citizenship because you've proven residency here for 2 years. And the problem is that if you don't speak the language, though, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to fill out this paperwork. But women that are in shelters, if they've lived here for 2 years, the shelter helps you file paperwork, and it's much more likely that they're able to get citizenship and get whatever the healthcare rights under the national healthcare system. If you are divorced before 2 years with a child, the child gives you a stake in society. So apparently the way this F6 visa works is that once you get a child, you reapply for a different visa called an F6-2 visa. And so this makes it so it's like a separate visa for if you have a child, and then you're under your healthcare when you go to the hospital, you write like who's your family member that's actually a citizen, and that would be your child. Because apparently on their visa, they don't get a number that allows them by themselves to get healthcare. It has to be listed with a family member because their kind of visa is like an attachment visa. So when they are with a normal F6 visa, they put their husband's social security number down. When it's an F6-2 visa, they put their child's social security number down for them to get healthcare in the hospitals. And then so with a child, though, automatically with a child, you're allowed to live in the country for 18 years because you're allowed to live in the country until your child becomes a full-fledged adult. And so every year you have to reapply for a new F6-2 visa, but every year it will be granted as long as you're proving that you're living with that child, and as long as that child lives until adulthood. What's interesting is that a lot of these women, if they choose to get divorced and live by themselves, they need to work and earn money, and so sometimes they send their child back home, so their child can live in Cambodia or Vietnam and live there until the woman can make enough money to have their child come back. But because you have to reapply for a visa every year, you have to prove that you are working hard and having your child live with you. And if your child is not living with you at any point in time, you will not get granted that visa, and you'll have to be kicked out of the country. So it's a very delicate process, and a lot of the women illegally say that their child is here when it's not, but if it's detected, then they're automatically have to leave the country. If you get divorced after 2 years and you're with child, it's much easier to get a citizenship because you've already lived here for 2.5 years, and if you still have to have $3,000 in assets though, but if they have $3,000 in assets, then you can easily get citizenship because especially with a child, you're automatically allowed to stay there for 18 years in the country, and within those 18 years, you can apply for your citizenship. So this thing where I said the marriage is uncertain, if they go out of the country. So what I described before was when the child leaves the country, but if the woman herself leaves the country at any point in time within those first 4 years for citizenship, then her citizenship is put in jeopardy because she's leaving the country and is separated from her husband, and so the marriage can't be proven. So this had happened with one woman that I interviewed that was from Cambodia. So she was married for more than 2 years. She had 2 children, but before she'd actually gotten citizenship, her in-laws were well, we're not happy with this marriage. This marriage is not good, just go back to Cambodia, leave your children here. And so they gave her the ticket, and she didn't know what to do. She had no other friends. And so she took the ticket back to Cambodia, but then her husband was no, I want you back. And so the husband got her ticket to come back, but the fact that she had left the country meant that she couldn't get her citizenship. So now she's a citizen, but at this point, she's a divorced woman, and she applied for citizenship based off of her having kids in the country. So it's like all the cases are slightly different. What was interesting about this case, though, was the fact that the marriage itself was healthy. Like between the woman and the man, it was a fairly healthy marriage, but the fact that it was like the in-laws were the ones that made it so that she got a divorce with the husband. And the reason why the in-laws were so powerful was because in that family, that husband was the 5th child, but the 1st son. So the parents lived with him, but because he was the youngest child, he had no voice or no power against his parents. The parents basically just overtook any decision that had to do with the wife, and the husband didn't say anything against it, even though he was perfectly happy with the wife. And so it was an interesting situation. And that goes, that follows through with the status of women in the family. So your in-law relationship is huge in these marriages. The in-laws are the ones that have the most prejudice against the woman. The husband, naturally, the husband feels like he owns the wife, and he thinks that the way that Korea made it seem to promote marrying internationally was they made it seem like the husband is like, you're providing some gift to the woman by allowing them to marry you. It's like, I am your savior, you're welcome, I will marry you. And in doing that, it provides a superiority over the woman, and it makes it so that the woman feels like any illness or sickness that she has is a weakness, and it means like a damaged goods, damaged products. And so because of that, they are scared to tell the in-laws whether they aren't comfortable eating the food because they're not used to the acidity of the fermented foods here, or they're not used to the weather, or they actually don't want a child, or they're really sick and they want to go to the hospital. These kind of things, they don't feel like they can voice it because it means that they're weaker, and they're afraid that if they show they're weaker, then they won't be necessary anymore and the husband can get a new wife, which has happened. Like, it's not difficult for a husband to divorce and then remarry another woman from a different country. And then the in-laws tend to use that as leverage to get what they want out of their child's relationship. And there also tends to be a lot of domestic violence. Naturally, domestic violence is the highest crime as far as crime goes in Korea, but it's especially high amongst interracial marriages. And the last one, shelter culture, is one that's slightly different and one I didn't expect to find when I came here to Korea. So I was talking about the shelters that I go to that were urban and rural, but there's a different separation that's between private and public shelters. So the private shelters are ones that are run by like foundations, and then they get grants, and so they get like funding money from private donors. And the public ones are ones that are funded by the government. And what I found in at least the 10 shelters that I studied was that in the private shelters, they spend more effort and energy to have the woman live on their own successfully. So they will require the woman to pay a certain rent to live in the shelter per month. It'll be like $100 per month. But by charging that, they also help them get a job, and they'll take a fraction of that money that they earn from the job as the rent. If they're not able to pay for that rent, the shelter will cover it, but they still expect the woman to live on their own. They also they help them more assimilate into the society. They'll provide Korean classes, English classes, they'll provide daycare, they provide school for the kids. They provide like health clinics at that time until they're actually naturally able to get insurance. As opposed to the public shelters that I've seen, they house the woman for anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, and they give it completely for free. There's like nothing asked from these women. It's completely for free, but the women aren't allowed to work while they're in the shelter, so they're not able to earn for themselves. They don't get any money while they're there. And during that time, they promote reconciliation between the woman and the husband. So regardless of what happened, regardless of whether it was domestic abuse, regardless of whether it was just like some kind of tip that they had, the goal of them is to get the family back together. So several times I've seen this be successful, but I've also seen an equal amount of times where the woman goes back to the husband, then comes back to the shelter, then runs back to the husband, then runs back to the shelter. And in that, it just promotes instability, and it never lets the woman like really decide for herself, because she just escapes to one place or the other as things get tough. And so it's interesting how that culture works. I don't really know what's right. I can't say, it's not my place to say what's right and what's wrong. It's just an interesting phenomenon that I've seen. Slowly, the public shelters are starting to allow the women to work for themselves, but they tend to make like those little hair ties at home or the bow ties where it's pretty much like 51 per bow tie that they make is what they earn, which is very, very little. Finally, one of the bigger barriers that I've seen is like based on low socioeconomic status. So where these women work and where they live are in the poorer working conditions, unsanitary living. They have like a lot of health problems that arise from that, from like the pollution and from the stress of having a new environment. What's interesting is that there are some empirical studies that say that the natives in Korea actually report themselves as being less healthy than the migrant women do. So the migrant women say that they're actually like healthier, but there are different things that could explain why this is the case. So one thing is the healthy migrant effect. This is where automatically the women that choose to migrate from their home country into Korea are going to be the healthier set. If you're really sick, you're not going to move countries. So you're comparing a healthier population of people to like a normal population where there's sickness and health combined. The second effect is the salmon effect, which is where if the women migrate into Korea, but then they become sick, then they just go back home. They go back to their country. And so the women that remain in the country are the ones that are healthier, so it's not an accurate description or an accurate measurement of the health consciousness. The other one is language. Language is where, the reason why that's up there is when they're answering the questions, they don't really know what the question means, and they're like, well, I guess I'm not going to commit suicide tomorrow, so I guess I'm fairly happy. As opposed to, like in South Korea, if the natives, they truly understand what the question's asking and they can answer it more accurately. I put down health records here because also in Korea, the way that the health system works is that each hospital has their own health record for you. It's not one that's carried through hospitals because it's hospital-centered, not patient-centered that way, at least for these women. And so because of that, when they go from hospital to hospital, they're not able to accurately explain what their pre-existing conditions are. And so each time it has to be reevaluated, and without being able to explain properly, then there is a lot of symptoms that get lost in translation. Even though on the surveys it says that the self-reports that the native Koreans are healthier than the migrants, what is different and what is worse is the mental health. So the self-reporting of immigrants say that there are twice the amount of depressed women as there are natives for the immigrants. And that's like a mental health difference. And mental health is already one of the leading problems in Korea. Korea has the #1 suicide rate. And this, the fact that it's even worse with the immigrants, not the suicide rate, but the fact that their mental health is worse is something to be concerned about. But Korea right now is not very equipped to handle mental health. They don't have that much of an emphasis in it in their hospitals, and that's one thing that it is lacking in. And that's really hard to communicate mental health and saying that you're depressed to a doctor and make that sound like a legitimate concern. A lot of the times they're like, oh, I'm really sad or I'm tired, and they only know this basic vocabulary to describe how they're feeling. And because of that, the families are like, well, just move on, like we're not happy today either, you just do your thing. And so because of that, it's not understood as it actually being a medical condition, and it's thought to be the woman's fault. So the woman thinks that this is, again, they're damaged goods, they should get over it if they still want to stay here in Korea. And that's a really, really large difference that I think is between the immigrants and the current native citizens that should be addressed when thinking about healthcare or policy changes. The last is understanding of the system. So with lower socioeconomic status, from where they're coming from, they may not be familiar with healthcare there itself, but they're also not familiar with how it works in Korea. So even understanding the fact that they should get insurance, they don't know. They just go when with their husband, or they go with their mother-in-law, if they're allowed to go at all. They don't realize that they have the right to go themselves. They also don't understand if they go to the doctors, then once you get a prescription, that means you have to go to the pharmacy to get your medication. They get a paper and they're like, well, that's nice. and they just go back home, but they don't realize it's a medication they're supposed to take. They also feel like when they're talking to the doctors, because it's such limited language, they don't feel like the doctors are really understanding the condition that they're having, and because of that, that promotes them to like not go to the hospital as much, especially when it's a mental health concern. Even if your husband is the best husband in the world, if you don't have that language skills to communicate how you're feeling about mentally, then even the husband trying to understand it won't be able to convey that to the doctor, and that ends up being a huge translational problem. So overall, this is so far what I've discovered as being general barriers to accessing healthcare or having a healthier society. At this point, I guess the next step would be like advocacy or what policy changes there could be. Because I haven't finished my interviews, I don't know, I haven't come up with a comprehensive list of things of what to change, but at the initial level, one thing would be to have more education about mental health for the doctors, to be able to know how to address these issues. I also think that based off in the rural areas, because the villages are so concentrated, to be like one village that's only Korean and Vietnamese, another village that's only Korean and Filipina, that you can target those areas to try to understand what are the natural health problems that arise. Because women from like Vietnam, they're coming from a much warmer climate, and the winters here, they naturally tend to have swollen lymph nodes, they tend to have like breathing problems, but the doctors address it as if it was a native Korean getting those problems as opposed to it being a climate difference problem. And so if those health concerns were known by the doctors and addressed that way, then it could possibly be a more healthier style of living for these women. And I also think that obviously language and cultural frame shift would be ideal. Those are harder to have, but so right now Korea is working on having a health education book written in different languages for these women. And at first that might seem like these women may not read it, but from talking to these women, they are so eager to be able to read anything that they can read because they're so used to not understanding anything that if there's something out there that's they can access, it's likely that they'll take advantage of it. And those are my conclusions of my project. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Can you talk about the age? You mentioned that a lot of these women are young.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, are some of them under the age of 18? Or?
So, there probably are some that are under the age of 18, but only reported when they come in, it's above the age of 18. Yeah. So if they are under the age of 18, they don't have a legal birth certificate, so they just claim that they're adults. Yeah.
So there's a difference between private shelters and public shelters,
right,
and how the private shelters try to give women their independence. Are there any agendas that the private shelters are like?
So a lot of the private shelters tend to be religious ones. So it'll be like the Catholic shelter, or it'll be a different section of some religion, and so every Sunday will be some kind of religious ceremony, or like Saturday, and so the main thing that they would possibly push there is just, conversion. Yes, Dory. Oh, thanks.
You said that the Filipino women tend to be older.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, because of their language, if they speak English, I'm wondering if they are sort of an advantage compared to the other.
Yeah, so the Filipino women, a lot of the ones that are divorced, end up becoming English teachers to a certain extent. So they're not, usually, like, it's funny because when I was at the shelter, in order to become more comfortable with the women, I was volunteering like my English skills to like teach them. And these Filipino women wanted to learn English from me so that they could have better English skills to teach it in the future. And so there was one woman who's from Busan that taught English there, and her English wasn't that good, but it was good enough that it was some sort of an advantage for her. And so it allows them to get citizenship quicker because they're able to prove the $3,000 asset faster. And they're able to communicate with international people in general. Yes?
I was curious, you talked a lot about the failed marriages. But
yes.
How, what are the rates of marriages that actually stick together in this arrangement? And then, but I guess my second question is, what are the rates of, if they end in divorce?
Yes.
How many of these women stay in Korea versus go back to their home country?
So out of the entirety of people who have international marriages, especially within the past 20 years of the Southeast Asian women, 10% of them get divorced. And the ones I am actually not sure as far as the percentage of women that go back to their country after divorce. The thing is that the statistics and the studies that I've done, most of the ones are empirical studies. There haven't been enough measuring overall numbers. Every 2 years they have the survey called this Healthy Family Study. That's mainly for the multicultural woman. The last one was conducted in 2011, and the one that conducted in 2013, the data has just been being analyzed right now, but they don't ask the question, they don't measure which ones have left the country yet, so I'm not sure. Or if it's there, it's in a Korean journal I can't read.
I have two things.
Yeah.
The first one is, what effect do you think the recent changes to the spouse visa are going to have? Because they've just, sorry, I have a vested interest in this. They've changed, as of I believe March, the requirements for spouse visas. The husbands have to have a verified income of a certain amount. You have to prove that you at least have one mutual language. So what sort of impact do you think this will have? The second thing, sorry, doing that awful. The second thing is more of something that I'd be curious about for future research.
Yeah.
When you talked about differences in levels of reported health between the native population and the migrant population.
Right.
One of the things I thought back to is that a lot of my Korean acquaintances have very different discourses of health than I'm used to, particularly surrounding things like pregnancy.
Right.
When my Korean friends tend to get pregnant, there's a lot of talk about these horrible health issues that arise, and when I ask them about them, they're very specifically Korean.
Right.
Your knees deteriorate when you get pregnant, and you'll become cold too easily. So there's a lot of discourse about that I wonder maybe some of the reported differences in health are due to not just actual levels of health, but discourse about
Yes.
healthcare.
So for the first issue, I think that will change the marriages in a positive way, especially the ones that happen in the urban areas. I do believe in the rural areas, they kind of bypass the law and they come in and then there's like, wait, this is my wife, like, let me just let her in. You know, because if they got married in Korea, then they would like to follow those rules, but a lot of them, they get married internationally. And they follow the rules of that international country. And then so when they come in, then sometimes there's an issue with proving that it's their wife. But I think that especially in the rural areas, it may not make an immediate change. As far as the second one for the discourse, I think that's true. I think that their self-reported health is a very subjective thing. And people have different standards of what healthiness is. And I have no... there's no way of saying that it's like they're on the same way of measuring the same standard, right? Just something else? Oh, no, okay. Yes.
How have the children of these marriages adapted to being a mix in terms of if they're especially under the care of parents who have many mental illnesses. Sorry, and how has that impacted them, especially in the rural areas where I'm sure these children are non-full Korean blooded.
Right, and so from what I've heard of shelters, it really depends on the population of migrant children in that area. So the greater amount of half Vietnamese, half Cambodian children there are, the more likely they'll have like these weekend communities or where it just becomes like almost like a happy place. Like there's like this one really small rural community like southwest of Korea, and it's just like the happiest place. Like there's like no difference between like the races, but that's very rare. The places that they face the most discrimination are actually in the main metropolitan cities like perhaps like Chuncheon or like Gwangju, where there's like smaller cities, but enough that there's not enough migrant children to make a community. And so then they face a lot of prejudice. They face a lot of discrimination, and they end up spending most of their time at home without spending time with children around.
If a woman has a child, is she more likely to stay, or is she more likely to go back to her country?
If they have a child, they're more likely to stay. They rarely leave when they have a child, and that's mainly because where they come from is just that much worse.
How do they support a child here?
Here, so as far as I'm aware, if they have any sort of skill, like a Filipina, they teach English. Otherwise, they work in factories. And the child usually stays with someone else of like their same community during the daytime, and then they have to work in factories and get minimal wages. But it's a struggle and it's hard, which is why a lot of the times the woman loses custody of the child because the husband gets the child back. And when the woman loses custody, then they lose their stake. But they try their best to keep the child with them.
In the Korean system, are the women entitled to any child support in enforcement?
Are they what?
Entitled to any child support?
The women?
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure if they are. Yeah. If it's in a Korean household, so if they get a divorce, if they get child support? I don't know, actually. Yeah. They don't, I guess. Yeah, they don't.
They don't necessarily have custody anyway in Korea. Usually, if it's a non-US father,
Yeah.
This was so interesting. I was kind of struck by one thing about how with the way the visas are designed,
Right.
that the woman becomes dependent on the men, if the husband for the visa, and then dependent on the child.
Right.
And it seems like a very Confucian way where the woman has no independent power,
Right.
like she's not given her own identity, but has to rely on her husband or her child to like be somebody.
Right.
And so I was just wondering if you've looked much at how, the issues that these women are confronting are related to broader issues that Korean women in Korean society have about like power.
A lot of them overlap. It's just, so when I was looking at how the problems that the women have, like in relation to even like in-laws and their place in society and the family, it's the same problems that Native Korean women face. The only thing is that the Native Korean women are much more familiar with the culture, and they're familiar with how the systems of like healthcare work. They have other community members, they have other friends to lean on, as opposed to,
They even have their own
They even have their own families, right? They have their own parents to protect, but then to protect them. But then these women, they're just completely dependent upon whichever family they get married into. Yeah, but the problems are the same. It's just the support system is different. Yes.
I know there's a lot of questions.
Oh, I'm sure.
So the low birth rate is one of the factors driving international.
Yes.
What is the birth rate of the marriage migrants? How much higher is it, or is it?
Oh, of just the migrants itself.
So if a migrant marriage, like somebody who comes here, what's their birth rate projected to be?
On average, they each have 2 kids. So it's not much more than 2. Because after they have 2 kids, they figure out some way not to have kids anymore. Yeah. But then the average birth rate ends up being less than 2 because a lot of the women just don't have kids, or they divorce before they have a kid. But I'm not I don't know the exact number, but it's less than 2.
So they're provided healthcare access, and a lot of them don't use it initially for the various reasons.
Right.
One, if they're able to do it independently, is there any government restrictions on like contraception?
No, there's not any government restrictions as far as like getting, for what?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so it's not, there's no different policies relating to marriage migrants for how they can get contraception. It's just their knowledge of it is different. Yeah.